Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2020 Vision, the Crime Fiction Panel Best of the Year for the year 2020. And I see that we already have a very distinguished audience, and we have two distinguished panelists. Now, you might wonder why there are not three distinguished panelists, and I'll tell you why, as I introduce people. Laura Wilson, and that's not Laura Wilson, that is Victoria, who's sitting to my side. Is the author of 13 acclaimed psychological crime novels. Stratton's War won the CWA Ellis Peters Award for Best Historical Fiction, and The Lover won the Prix du Polar Européen, and two of her books have been shortlisted with the CWA Gold Dagger. Laura is also, of course, The Guardian's crime fiction reviewer and co-programmer of the Killer Women Festival. I am Laura Wilson tonight. I am standing in for her because Laura has had technical problems. So what she's done is she sent me all her the views on the books that she wanted to talk about. So I will read out the things that she wants me to say about her books. I'm Barry Forshaw. I'm the crime critic of the Financial Times, and I've written such books as Crime Fiction, A Reader's Guide, and a lot of other books. And we've got two distinguished panelists. I assume you can see them to the left and the right, which are Paul Burke, waving there, just in case you thought that was Victoria waving. That's Paul Burke. Paul Burke writes the Verdict column for NB Magazine, contributes to the Crime Time site, www.crimetime.co.uk, and he reviews fiction in translation for the European Literature Network. Victoria Selman has written for The Independent and The Daily Express and co-hosts the true crime podcast, Crime Girl Gang. She is the best-selling author of the Zeba Mackenzie Criminal Profiler series. The first novel, Blood for Blood, was shortlisted for the CWA Debut Dagger and was an Amazon chart #1 bestseller for 5 weeks. The latest Zeba Mackenzie novel, Snakes and Ladders, is out now. So between us, in the next hour, with your contributions, we are going to tell you what the best crime fiction was for the year 2020. We will inevitably have people saying, where the hell was X? Where the hell was Y? Not least those people who we aren't going to mention. But we're going to try to mention all of them. And I'm going to start with Paul's first choice, which is a fairly obscure one. Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. Paul, why did you choose that?
It's because I like to claim literary novels as crime novels. Yeah, slightly obscure, but this actually was nominated for the International Man Booker. It's Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, and it's translated by Sophie Hughes. It's a pretty devastating novel to start with. It's an incredibly powerful novel. It was about the brutal murder of a woman in a Mexican border region. A group of children playing find her body dumped on farmland near a river. And the prose is stark and visceral and angry. The crime is brutal, but it's an investigation of how it came to happen. It's actually a forensic investigation of how it came to happen. All about the motive. It's sort of elements of an Inspector Calls, if you like, in it. And it's about how you wind up with nearly the whole of the population of the hamlet of La Matosa actually involved and implicated in some way in the woman's murder. This is a kind of cursed place. There's a collective guilt. This crime is one of many. So what it actually is a reflection on the thousands of women who are murdered every year in Mexico, a crime that we now come to call femicide. I think 35,000 people were murdered in Mexico last year, and unfortunately, a huge portion of them were women. It's a tough look at both the individuals and society. It's about the machismo, the poverty, the superstition. The woman is referred to as a witch. She inherits a small parcel of land, so it's assumed she murdered her husband in order to get it, just because he happened to die young. There's absolutely no evidence of that. She was a friend to the local prostitutes, and she saves a girl from her stepfather who thinks it's his prerogative to be able to abuse the child. So she also comforts the women of the village when their husbands stray and helps people with potions and all sorts of things. But of course, they all turn against her. The book gradually widens its scope. So it's not just an excoriation of the local population, but it actually includes the drug cartels and the oil companies that exploit it. It's about the incompetence and corruption of the police force and the government. So it's actually a very emotional book, but it's not wrought. It's an intelligent tale. It's about domestic abuse of women in general, and most devastating crime, and one that we just don't take seriously anyway. And I like books that have this real world feel about them. So there are usually two kinds of books that deal with this kind of thing. You can have that very personal story, that psychological story that deals with a particular person's issues, or you can have something that deals with this in a societal way and talks about in general how this affects everybody. This book basically does both. So it's about individual pain, and it's about the hypocrisy of society as well. As I said, it's stark. It's a very brutal book at times, but there are also some incredibly beautiful long sentences, and it just is one of those devastating reads.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there, Paul. Otherwise, we're never going to get through everything.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to pick a book which is much more mainstream, and I'm glad you led off with something which is maybe drawing it to people's attention. But I imagine that most people are familiar with Stuart Turton and The Devil and the Dark Water. We were talking earlier about the notion of second book syndrome and how to overcome second book syndrome. Stuart Turton did it after the first book. I wrote in the Financial Times, Turton's debut, The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, was a hard act to follow, but lightning has struck twice. On a voyage to Amsterdam in 1634, the merchant ship Saardam becomes the scene of gruesome death. And then I called it a genre-sampling epic that sets outrageous traps for the reader and builds an atmosphere of dread. It's an amazing book, and it's quite unlike any other crime novel that you are likely to have read. So, Victoria, what's your first choice?
What's my first choice? Well, I got 5 brilliant books to share with you guys tonight, and I've taken a slightly different approach. So I've chosen a few books. Some are complete debuts that I think have looked at tried and tested things in a new and exciting way. Others are stories that are very high concept, but really do deliver in a way that high concept often doesn't. But I'm going to start with Harriet Tice's new book, since we're talking about second book syndrome. This is The Lies You Told. And I won't go into huge detail about the synopsis. Suffice it to say, being Harriet's book, it's incredibly pacey, as you'd expect from her. And it calls into question who we can trust and what happens when we trust the wrong people. And it has 2 different storylines. So it has the storyline of a mother trying to protect her child, and a parody of pushy, overprotective mothers, which I can certainly empathise with a bit, having stood at certain school gates a little bit too long. And really enjoyed that aspect. And there's also, of course, being Harriet, her USP is the legal side of things. So she has her character going into chambers after a long period of absence and takes us into that world, which I find really compelling, but also has a parallel storyline that works with that, but also resonates with the first storyline as well. So she weaves the 2 together really nicely. And the title, in a way, sort of reflects that also. So The Lies You Told refers to both the lies that the defendant, the protagonist is defending, that he tells, but also the lies that her husband tell, the lies that the kids at school tell, the lies that the mothers who protect the kids at school tell, and ultimately, like I said, who you can trust. And I found it great. As you can probably see from its slightly battered form, I took it everywhere with me, including in the bath, which just goes to show how much I enjoyed it. So a really story from Harriet.
Like me, you're a friend of Harriet Tice's, and you followed her from the first book on. I was very relieved that her books have turned out to be so good, because it's always that fear that there might be a disappointment. I'm going to give you Laura's first choice here. I've only got 1 sentence about it from The Guardian, but it's a book that we can all talk about because it's one of 2 excellent books by Black writers. And Laura wrote of Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby. A young Black Virginian father with a criminal past is trying to go straight in a world where the odds are stacked against him. It was very difficult this year to avoid these 2 superb books by Black writers. I think you read it, Paul. What did you think?
It's a stunning book. It is, for all the reasons that it's a political book and it's a devastating book in that sense. But this is also truly an incredible an incredible sort of heist movie, if you like, as well. You know, it's a fantastic sort of read. One of the most page-turning books I've read this year, certainly.
It's interesting that Ian Mills published a couple of years ago, Bill Beverly's Dodgers, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which was terrific. Now, it's quite interesting that that book was by a middle-aged white academic dealing with a Black experience. I'm not sure you could get away with that anymore. Do you think? Victoria?
Sorry, Victoria.
Sorry, I was distracted because I was reading the comments in the sidebar. I'm sorry.
Victoria.
It's a superb book. I'm thinking I haven't read it, but I must do. Would you mind repeating the question, Barry?
The question was, is it more tricky now as we're in an era of cultural appropriation? Well, Will Beverley wrote Dodgers, which was about the Black experience. He is a white, middle-aged academic, and there was no stick at all. There was no criticisms of him. He just won lots of awards. Yeah. Are we now in an age where that kind of writing, sadly, is a thing of the past? Like, playing Othello.
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? And people refer to dipping your pen in other people's blood. I personally have a problem with that. I think it depends, first of all, how you're dipping your pen. If you're dipping it sensitively, then I think actually there's a lot that can be brought to the table. So, for example, I recently read, it's not a crime novel, although in a sense it was the greatest crime of all history, but The Tattooist of Auschwitz. And interestingly, because it's based on a true story, the Jewish man whom it's about deliberately chose a non-Jewish female author to write the story for him. And he says the reason he did that is he wanted the distance, that being slightly away from that. He said, you know, if I had a Jewish person write it, they would have come to it with certain filters. But by having someone slightly outside that world, it was seen in a different way. And actually, I think that was a really interesting point and something I've really sort of taken to heart. So I think if it's done well, I personally think, why not? Although I suppose it obviously throws up the other question in terms of certain minorities, that of course there are so few voices necessarily from different minorities that if they can tell the story, is there an argument that that should be done by them? So I can see it both ways, I think.
That's well argued. I see we have very distinguished people listening into this. We have Craig Sisterson, we have Iona Tudder, so we better up our game for, which I'm now going to give you a chance to up your game by talking about Bent by Joe Thomas.
You mean cut it down, you mean? No, it's a good book. This is the biographical fiction of Harold Tanky Challoner. Legendary cop, war hero. It's set in the early 60s in Soho. It's also set during the war in Italy. But it's about the fall of the man. At the opening of the book, he's at the Old Bailey, he's on trial. It's not a question of whether he's guilty. This man loves to fit up criminals. He's absolutely guilty. The question is whether he's actually sane. And what Joe Thomas manages to do with this book fantastically is give you that picture so that when you get to the point where you finally get back to the trial and find out what the decision of the judges are, you've actually understood his madness. And it comes partly from time during the war when you've got this man who in a way comes out with PTSD. He doesn't know how to fit back into civilian life. And he basically acts as a warrior in a way that he acted as a warrior during the war. He was a member of the SAS. And Joe Thomas captures that perfectly. And you get a sense of the man and his madness. I think the thing I'd say about it as well is the style of the novel. I absolutely love this. It's written in that kind of fragmented style that you get from James Ellroy or you get from David Peace. And yet it manages to conjure these pictures perfectly. It makes you work a little bit and you put the picture together. And I think at the end of it, it's an absolutely convincing portrait of a man who has gone mad, if you like.
Okay. I've seen a question from Natasha Williams. We've got a very lively audience, you know. They're having this debate on the right of the screen here, talking about the books that we're talking about.
I was distracted.
That's very good. Why aren't you paying attention to us? Natasha has just asked about a book that we talked about. Natasha, everything that we talk about tonight will be posted on the website tomorrow. We are going to try to stay on message. My next choice would be that second black writer I talked about, which I think everybody liked. In fact, both Paul and I have interviewed him. I did an interview with him last week for Waterstones, which is John Virchow, and the book is called 3/5, which is another just terrific novel. I wrote in the Financial Times, excoriating and mesmeric. Virchow's remarkable debut addresses issues of race in America, but scrupulously avoids woke tendentiousness. Mixed-race Bobby Saracino has been nervously passing as white, but an encounter with a friend released from prison and now a white supremacist leads both men into violent territory, complex, pungent, and timely. What I liked about the book that it wasn't kind of, as I think a lot of, I'm going to be controversial here, we said we're going to be controversial, a lot of black art at the moment, which we're seeing thankfully a lot more of, does to be slightly tendentious and paints the characters in maybe a more noble, more self-sacrificing way than it should do. John Butcher doesn't romanticize any of his characters, and he makes his protagonist flawed, interesting, and human. You read it, I think, Paul, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, he definitely does do that. I think the part of the book is it's about a place called Homewood. It's what we would call in this country postcoded. It's one of those places that is automatically blacklisted, but he wanted to make a point that there are lots of ordinary people there. They're not good people or bad people. They're just ordinary people. And you get to see this because it is a multi-voice kind of novel. You get to see it from different perspectives as well. I think the remarkable thing is the way he creates the white supremacist character and makes him, he makes him a rounded character, let's say. But this is an incredibly compassionate novel, and it has a truly devastating ending too, doesn't it?
And it's interesting, he said when he was writing the white supremacist character, his initial conception, John said, was of the villain. And then he realized he couldn't do that. He had to make him a rounded character because no villain is a villain to himself. So Victoria, you're up again now. And your next choice, I think, is We Begin at the End by Chris Whitaker.
Oh, this book, I have to tell you, We Begin at the End. It's not for me just the best book of the year. This is the best book of the decade. It's one of the best contemporary crime novels I've ever read. And what's to me so exciting about it is my understanding is it wasn't launched with one of these big fancy schmancy budgets and huge marketing campaigns, but it was a book that took off because it was so fabulous through word of mouth and has been so massively and rightly embraced by certainly the crime community is the one that I'm familiar with, but by the crime community. And to me, it's almost a book that isn't just a crime book. I mean, obviously there's a murder mystery at its heart, but you could almost read it just as happily without that being in it. Because it's a story about humanity and redemption and love and relationships and the characters. I mean, the girl character, Duchess, I mean, she reminds me, I don't know about you guys, but she reminds me of Scout somehow from To Kill a Mockingbird. Something about it.
Well, I think that's echoed in the actual character names, isn't it? There's Scout is echoed. There's Radley or
it is Radley, yes.
Oh, see, I missed that. Okay, you're much cleverer than I am. But there you go then. So maybe it was subliminal messaging from Chris Whitaker there. But no, but it really, really works. And he captures this small town America in such an authentic way. It's almost hard to believe he's an English writer. You know, I was trying to write, we talked a bit about my second book syndrome earlier when we were in the green room, a standalone, which I've actually put to one side at the moment. And I was setting in America. And oh my goodness, what a mess I made of it, because it just wasn't authentic. And I was having to look up did they say this? And do they use that language? But he gets it and it just works. And you could be there. And it's almost timeless in its appeal. It's a book you could read and reread, not because you want to know what happened, but because you want to remind yourself of how it happened and who it happened to. It's just utterly fabulous. I can't recommend it.
Well, I think we'd all agree on that book. We were all greatly impressed by Chris Whitaker. In fact, I had a late call from the Eye, who I do some things for, and they asked me to pick a crime book of the year, and I'd already done the FT, but I used the Chris Whitaker because it is so good, as you say. I'm going to give you Laura's recommendation here. It's Gin Patrol on the Purple Line by Deepa Anapara, story of a child living in an Indian slum who investigates the disappearance of a school friend. She also mentioned John Butcher's Pittsburgh Set 3/5, a man trying to come to terms with his mixed race identity. So your next book, Paul?
That would be Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This one's a surprise for me. This is the book that I would never have thought in the first place that I would find in my own list. It's a Gothic story, and I'm not big on Gothic stories. But Maxim suggested another book by her, Maxim Jakubowski. And so off the back of that, I read this one, and I just thought it was absolutely beautifully written. The story's been shifted to 1950s Mexico, and it's very much this play on the old world and the new world. For me, I read it anyway as a sort of a colonial thing too, an attack on colonialism and values. But essentially, a woman, an heiress, marries a rich man. A rich heiress marries a man. He takes her away from the family. Then she writes a letter home saying he's trying to kill her. And the niece is sent along to actually investigate what's going on. And you get that creepy line between crime. Are these just a family manipulating? or is there something horrific and something worse going on? And it becomes a book about decay, and the character and atmosphere of the book is absolutely incredible. So this is just a book that knocked me out. I mean, as I said, it wasn't the kind of book I thought I'd find. It's a book that impressed me as much as Fingersmith did.
Which was a long time ago.
By Sarah Waters, yeah.
You mentioned colonialism. I suppose we should name check, because we're really going to try to put so much into this hour. Two terrific Anglo-Indian writers, Abir Mukherjee and Vasim Khan, who are dealing with the legacy of empire and colonialism, but in a subtle and nuanced way. They're not simply saying, it's all bad. There's definitely nuance in their writing. My next choice was by a woman who I once sat next to. I've only ever met her once, and she doesn't travel anymore. And I think I might know why. It's Tana French. This is a meal that Hodder gave several years ago. She apparently didn't enjoy it, and she doesn't like doing. But why does she need to do things in public? The Searcher by Tana French. I wrote in the FT. American-born, Ireland resident, French, has a good claim to be the most consummate writer of psychological crime at work today. This is a new departure. A Chicago detective moves to a cloistered Irish village and becomes involved in a missing persons case. An idyllic rural life inexorably moves into nightmare territory. I thought it was very good, and I think Laura Wilson also picked Tana French's The Search as one of her books of the year. Have you read it, Victoria?
No, I haven't. I actually haven't read any Tanya French, but I've heard such wonderful things. I think I must remedy that as quickly as possible.
You need to. I think you've read her, Paul, have you?
I have, but not this book yet. It's one of those that I think I put aside for myself for Christmas.
Right. Okay, Victoria, your next choice.
My next choice, let's see, what shall I pick? I've got them sitting next to me. You know what, actually, I'm going to pick the one that I don't have sitting next to me because I couldn't find it, but it's somewhere very carefully put, and it's After Dark by Dominic Nolan. Now, Dominic Nolan, watch out for this name, because mark my words, this guy is going to be on a Booker list one day. You heard it here first. He is possibly one of the most talented writers, I believe, of our generation. His writing is so restlessly poetic, you will stop and just savor a sentence and find yourself savoring it for a good 10 minutes before you carry on reading. It's that brilliantly good. After Dark is a follow-on from his first book, which was Past Life. That was his debut. And it picks up where that story left off with his character, who's in a slightly uncomfortable position, and he examines the effect of amnesia on a character and what it means to be human. And his strapline for a book is one I would love to have come up with myself and find myself often quoting when I'm talking about some things that I've written, which is monsters are made, not born. And there you go. Thank you.
Just remember I had it there.
You have my book. That's where it's gone to. Now I know he's sneaking in. But it's absolutely phenomenal. And he's just such an interesting concept to explore. It's done really, really well. Really enjoyed it.
I'm going to put in an apology now to those people who are posting on the right hand side of the screen, because I'm trying to wrangle these two, and as you can see, it's tough work wrangling them. I'm not seeing all the comments. I've just seen that we have M.R. Mackenzie, who's one of our people engaged in The Library Murders was one of the most distinctive books I read this year. Really unusual. You read it as well, okay? So M.R. Mackenzie is there. So
can I just say something on Don Nolan? We got involved in a little chat about whether you say Cesar or Cesare because of Jerome Charin's book. But he's a big fan of Charin. The book, though, there's a bit in there, and I couldn't find it this morning because I was going to mark it out. But basically, there's a bit where he has a go at class. And there are a few goes at class in the book, and it's lovely. Then changes to Barb and her cold feet in her boots. And then we're suddenly straight back to a murder. And it's it's 3 sentences, and it just goes bang, bang, bang. And it's just a brilliant read for that reason, if nothing else. The language is fantastic in this book.
Phenomenal. But you know the other thing with Dom, sorry, and I know we've got so many other people to get through, but let me just say this one other thing. He puts a whole world, kind of almost as you're saying, in one sentence. So there's a scene in the book, and I forget exactly where it goes, but it's this character, Boone, and he describes how she's eating an egg and how she eats the whole yolk in one go. And it's a sentence or something like this, but just that tiny, I mean, his grasp of psychology and how to get the thought across, and the way he is extraordinary. I'm always in awe of Dom's writing.
Okay, and we've just had comments from Iona Tade and from various other people saying that Sean Cosby is a nice guy. Well, it's always nice when an author that you admire is a nice guy, but they don't have to be.
No, look at us.
James Ellroy is not a nice guy, but he's a great writer. Or was a great writer. Okay, my next choice is...
I'd hate to interview him, though.
My interview with him is something I will tell you about at length someday. I will always remember it.
I'll hold you there.
I have chosen one of the great modern American male crime writers, Don Winslow, and Broken. And this kind of came out of the blue because, in fact, we're used to these massive epics from Don. This was a series of 6 short novellas, Broken, and I wrote in the FT, there's a sense of hard-won, real-world authenticity to the gritty novels of Californian Don Winslow. But this is no blockbuster along the lines of The Border. It's a collection of 6 short novellas in pared-down Hemingway-esque prose. I thought it was terrific. Did you read it, Paul?
I did. I can only agree. I mean, he's a consummate writer anyway, but the humor, the kind of the way he got the compassion for people into these stories, and it did flow as a whole. You know, it's 6 short stories, but you get that sense of something bigger from reading it. So just fantastic.
Well, as I'm here as Laura Wilson, as you can clearly see, I'm now going to be Laura for a few seconds. Laura said about Broken, the last ride, the most powerful novella of the 6 that make up Don Winslow's collection, Broken, is the story of a Trump-supporting Border Patrol agent who undergoes a change of heart and vows to reunite a forcibly separated mother and child. Is there going to be a time when a discussion like this will not at some point name-check Donald Trump?
Probably not for a while.
I just did it, didn't I, Victoria? Victoria, what's your next choice?
My next choice. Let's see. Well, I've seen Philippa East popping up in the sidebar, so I think it's about time I talked about her book, Little White Lies. What I particularly like about this, it's her debut, and it doesn't read like a debut. It's very assured, very confident, which is really impressive, I thought. You know, for somebody, you know, at the very beginning of their career to write like this. But what particularly I found particularly enjoyable about it, was it takes a storyline that we've all seen often before. A girl has been abducted, she's gone missing, something's happened. And there normally the story ends, and normally the story is about the hunt for the girl or the devastation or what's happening to the girl while she's in captivity. But she looks at it from a different perspective, and she brings the girl home. And it starts at that point where you think it's happily ever after, except it's not. And we've talked about humanity and compassion. And for me, that's what this book is all about. It's understanding the psychological impact of a trauma, and sometimes realizing that the feelings you should have aren't the feelings you do have. So the mother and her mixed emotions towards her daughter. And I won't give away spoilers. I'm rubbish at spoilers. I ruined The Fall for my parents. So still sorry about that. But the ending as well, just as she turned the trope, if you want to call it a trope, on its head as in the story itself, so too with the end. It wasn't what we expected. It wasn't what we were leading up to. And I thought it was all the better for that. So really, really good.
Well done in avoiding the spoilers. I remember anybody old enough watching this to remember Happy Days did have at least one good joke, because it's set in 1960 and they're just setting out to see Psycho. And somebody said, I'm going to see this new Hitchcock film called Psycho. And somebody replied, yeah, great movie. Anthony Perkins is his own mother. I thought it was.
I think when the film came out, didn't they tell people not to say the ending?
Hitchcock did say it. We avoid spoilers whenever we can. So I'm seeing that from the comments on the right that everybody likes Don Winslow, and Io Notadi agrees that was the best story. Do you think we were supposed to discuss the odd topic in between our discussion of books? So I'll throw this out to both of you. Is the genre, Paul, in a good state at the moment?
Yes. That's a simple answer. I do think it is in a good state. I think that, well, first of all, there's the sales that indicate that. I mean, COVID interrupted us apart. Crime books are going up and up in sales. And taken over from all other forms of fiction. So that's good news. I think it's a more dynamic form than it used to be. I think there is a lot more diversity, and I think those things are healthy about it too. If anything, I think it's not the genre that's in trouble, but there are some tropes and there are some ways of writing perhaps that are a little bit in trouble and maybe could do with a bit of a refresh.
Okay,
But generally, on the whole, I think it's a very healthy situation at the moment.
you just mentioned that, Paul. So I'm gonna tell you which one it is. It's the secret history trope, and it's the I know what you did last summer trope, which is where a group of friends at university get together in an isolated setting. Somehow somebody died 10, 20 years ago, and somebody is picking them up one by one. It's kind of a variation on Then There Were None. But don't we think, Victoria, that plot should be given a bit of a rest at the moment?
I think there are lots of plots that should be given a rest, and I actually don't agree with Paul that the crime fiction is in a great shape. Actually, I think there's lots that's great about it, and obviously I love it. I wouldn't be writing and I wouldn't be reading as much if I didn't. But I'm disturbed, and readers obviously lap it up. I mean, nothing does well as a bit of crime, particularly in troubled times. But things trouble me. So, for example, when you have celebrity authors being ghost written just so they can have the name on a jacket and getting picked up because of that, I find a little bit disappointing. I also personally, here we go, I'm going to be controversial. You did ask me to be tonight.
Go ahead.
I also think it's a shame that editors aren't building up names in the way that perhaps they used to. So back in the day, you had Lee Child and, I don't know, all the big names that but now they don't really seem to do it in the same way. And it seems either you're expected to be immediate hit with your debut, in which case, brilliant, off you go. Or if not, you keep having to change your name until you suddenly get the big breakout. And what the Chris Whittaker book showed me is that actually, why should we expect a debut novel to be your first big thing? Surely as a writer, you should grow and mature over time and get better with each thing you write, not less good. And actually, perhaps we ought to give our crime writers all writers actually, a bit more breathing room to do that. But having said that, I think looking at the Philippa East book, we are seeing changes on existing storylines that are interesting. And I think having new voices coming in is always a great way to shake things up. So
that's a good point. But then I would argue against that, Victoria, that first novels that were the best books were The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler, Casino by Ian Fleming, Catcher in the Rye. No, Catcher in the Rye. Okay, we'll get back to our recommendation.
Those are books. Some of them that then didn't get on to write anything else. So it's like almost you have the big book inside you, but that's all you've got to say. There are stories like that. So that's
a good point. We were told off last time we did one of these things, Paul and I particularly, because it was all male faces. So we have a female face today, and we have me being gender fluid as Laura Wilson. So there's a female representation. And we were also told off for picking books which were not within the correct time period. And I've got The Deadline by Holly Watt. I think that was 2020, Paul.
I think so, yes. That's the second one, yeah.
So that would be mine. I'd also pick The Mist by Ragnar Jonasson. Ragnar is a writer who I've known for quite a few years. And he did a very interesting thing. I'll mention this to Victoria, as she's a novelist herself. He got really well known in Britain before a word of his had been translated into English. He went around the world. He kind of put himself about, if you like. Finally, he was translated, and his new book, The Mist, is a part of a trilogy, and is as good as anything he's written. So, your next recommendation, Paul?
That would be To Cook a Bear, Mika Naimi. Translated by Deborah Bragin Turner. It's an historical novel, the only one I've chosen, the really historical novel in the sense it's 19th century. It's set in Arctic Sweden in 1852 about a Sami community and a preacher who's a radical preacher who's also a botanist and a man of science. And it's really a clash of cultures, if you like. There's a murder, or rather there's a girl who disappears in the first place. It's assumed to be a bear. And nobody wants to move away from that theory except for the preacher who brings science to the issue. Yeah, so it's a clash of cultures. It's an interesting take on the proto-detective and the sidekick, who's a Sami boy who works with the preacher on actually trying to solve the murder. Of course, it has a very human killer at the end of the day. But what gets me about this book, what I like so much about this book, is it's a book about philosophy and natural science and culture. And it's actually built up a picture of the time that isn't just based on the costumes and the mannerisms of speech and so on, but it's actually a whole picture of the place and time. It's on the edge of the Enlightenment. And for that, it's an absolutely fantastic story. Very beautifully written, a very long book, but one of those that you're very happy to spend the time with.
It was also published by Quercus, am I right?
It was.
And Quercus is one of those publishers who are very good at spotting unorthodox, unusual books. As I'm trying to keep Laura present in this discussion, she said about Marion Brunet's award-winning Summer of Reckoning, translated from the French by Catherine Gregor. It takes place in a Provence that the holidaymakers never see, where poverty, boredom, and casual racism are the norm. So, Victoria, the next writer on your list has something in common with me, which is the fact that we're both Liverpudlians and neither of us speak with the accent. David Jackson.
Ah, there you go. I thought that was going to be a quiz. I was going to have to spot the book you were talking about. Okay, let's have for clues. Yes, so this is The Resident. This is actually a proof. So I don't know if the actual proper book looks exactly like this. This is published by Viper, David Jackson. And what I particularly enjoyed about this, and by the way, my enjoyment is testament to the fact that I didn't see my kids all weekend when I was reading it. I was loving it, couldn't put it down. Was so often you have a high concept book that just, I don't know if you guys find this, but just doesn't deliver. It's brilliant in theory, but when you read it, it falls completely flat. For me, this really didn't. It's about a serial killer. This is not a spoiler. A serial killer who basically gets into the crawl space, the roof eaves of a set of houses, and he's sort of spying on the people below. And it just taps into that nightmare, I think, that possibly all crime writers maybe have or should have, that what if a serial killer is watching you? And in this case, a serial killer is watching you. And it's very, what's the line he calls? There's a serial killer on the run and he's hiding in your house.
Well, I have to say, and much as I like David's books, we're talking about familiar plots. There's a film called Black Christmas, which is actually, there are two versions of the film Black Christmas, which has that plot. I thought David's book was terrific, and I didn't mind seeing a variation on that plot. So I'm going to put two choices here because we've got so much to get through. My next two choices are two old hands. They won't mind me calling them old hands. And they've done some of the very best work in the crime fiction genre for years. And they continue to get better and better. This is Denise Miner and Andrew Taylor. So The Less Dead by Denise is one of her best books yet, but one has said that about really the last 3 or 4 books. And The Last Protector by Andrew Taylor shows that he's still the man who really deserves every historical crime fiction award going. When I was a judge on the historical dagger, the CWE dagger, at one point it was called the Andrew Taylor dagger because he was just he or C.J. Sampson won every award, and they deserve to. So, Paul, your next choice.
Well, my next choice, actually, yeah, it's Winter Counts. David Hesker Wombley Wader. I hope I've said that somewhere close to how the man's name is actually pronounced, especially as I think he's with us tonight. So hello. This is a rural noir, and it's set on a Lakota Sioux Nation reservation called Rosebud. And it's just so rare to see. I don't know what it was. I saw this book in America, and I just asked the American publisher to send it to me, and then it turned out to be an absolutely fantastic read. I'm getting corrected on how you pronounce it. I'll get that right next time, I promise. So basically, the thing about this is with the rural noir is it's a bit like Cosby's book in the sense that it demonstrates that being poor and rural is one thing, being poor and rural and black, or from an American native nation, is a whole other thing because you have the racism on top. You've got a fantastic character called Virgil Wounded Horse, who's the main man in the story. He's a fist for hire, not necessarily a gun for hire. He gets dragged into a drugs war, which is to do with cleaning up the reservation. But of course, there's much more going on. He's the sole carer for his nephew, and his nephew actually winds up getting caught between the drug dealers and the feds. And it's a funny thing. It's a thing about sort of a coming of age for the boy, but it's more a coming of age actually for Virgil, who's got to do some growing up quickly if he's going to actually help his nephew to get out from under the trouble he's in. So from that point of view, it's a fantastic story. What we find here as well is that it's about the state of the reservation. There are problems with corruption there. There are problems with racism and corruption on the outside. One of the issues is that from a federal point of view, if the crime isn't actually murder or drugs, nobody cares about it. And that leaves a lot of issues undealt with. But Virgil, who's basically grown up ignoring his culture and ignoring the traditions, comes to realize actually their value in his life too. And so it's a fascinating cultural insight as well as a really good mystery. And I hope the first of many.
Okay, well, I'm here as Laura Wilson tonight. A couple more recommendations from Laura, which we've already discussed, but she has to be present. We begin at the end by Chris Whitaker. A brave, defiant 13-year-old girl battles valiantly to protect her family, but sets up a chain of catastrophic events that will have consequences for everyone around her. And then she says, Whitaker's Duchess Day Radley. See, Day Radley.
Yeah, there you go.
is the type of character who tugs at your heartstrings, as does young Trey Reddy and Connor Frenches, etc. I see that Craig Sisterson agrees with me about the new Denise Minor. Do you know that I'm, in fact, the English Craig Sisterson, in the same way that he is the Kiwi Barry Forshaw? And to prove this, if Craig is still listening and hasn't tuned out, today I reached for one of my own books, and off the shelf came Southern Cross Crime by Craig Sisterson. So that's very strange and very creepy. It wasn't the book I was reaching for.
You've made his day.
So Victoria, your next choice.
My next choice is, this is my last book, I think, for 2020, isn't it? So here we go, drum roll. This is 3 Hours by, can you see? Sorry, the light is glaring off at my head. Rosamund Lupton. So what's this is a siege story, and it's a school under siege, and everyone's hunkering down. There are gunmen on the loose, and nobody knows what's going on. And what's so interesting about it for me is it's, so often we read crime novels and they happen over a long period of time, and you get the tension building over days, and you've got that, all that going on. This is this very sort of Aristotelian thing about it's all confined within literally, I think it's even less than 24 hours actually, but adhering to that concept of time and place. And because of that, for me, it's like a pressure cooker situation. It just really, really works. And in addition to it being a story about tension and everything else, I think there are two things going on, I guess, as a reader, and it's actually something we'll talk about later when I talk about Gurley as well. It forces you to put yourself into the position of the characters in hiding, fearing for their lives, and makes you say, what would I do in their shoes? And oftentimes it actually makes you ask some quite uncomfortable questions as well. So there are some Syrian refugees in the story, and it sort of throws up the question of racism. And at times in the story, these characters being blamed for what's happening. Although she handles that in a very sensitive way. And I think that side of it's done very well. But a bit like the Chris Whitaker book, I think, you see how I'm going to be comparing everything to this book because I just think it's so fabulous, is there's also the elements of the humanity side of the story as well. So the story of friendship, the story of love, the story of how well do you ever know yourself until you're truly tested, really come through very strongly, as well as it being a thriller and very much of a high stakes drama. So really enjoyed that one as well.
Okay, well, now in our last quarter of an hour or so of the show, we're going to talk about 2021, but let's quickly name check a few things that also we have in a section here called notables from the year to be added on the long list. So there's a new Mark Billingham, of course. We need to mention 50/50 by Steve Kavanagh, which hit the ground running. A new Charles Cumming, Box 88. He's showing that the espionage novel is still alive and kicking, as is Mick Herron, and we'll be talking about Mick Herron. You also had Wild Dog, Paul, is that right?
Yes, a very visceral book, a book that brought a story. I had no idea where the story was going. It was fantastic from that point of view. A book about man against nature, and nature isn't easily beaten.
Andrea Camilleri had a book out, and that I think is possibly the last one, unless I'm because one more to come. One more, Andrea Camilleri coming.
Can I name check a book as well that I haven't read yet, which is a bit cheeky, therefore, to name drop it, but it's so much on my list. I would love to be talking about it had I only read it, which is The Man on the Street by Trevor Wood, which I've heard only fantastic things about, and I can't wait to get my hands on it.
I've heard that, and it's very good.
Yeah.
One of the great things about doing this job is to be taken up by publishers for meals, which for some reason isn't happening at the moment.
Why?
Amazing, isn't it? So Trevor's book we were instructed to read, and it is very good. So we also mentioned I've just been handed me a note about Andrea Camilleri. The book he's published is locked in the safe till his death, rather like Agatha Christie, who did the same thing with the final curtains.
So they finished in Italy, but we have 2 more to come, I think.
Yes, and as in the same way with Philip Kerr, there was a final book after his death. Okay, so we also had Wild Dog. We had These Women by Ivy Pachoda. Is it pronounced, Paul?
Yeah.
We think, okay. Blacktop Wasteland we talked about. Abiy Mukherjee's Death in the East, terrific. A Double Life, Charlotte Filby had a lot of good.
Absolutely loved that mix of domestic drama and spy story. Changing the way spy stories are written, not just Charlotte, actually, a few other female writers as well, but it's adding an interesting aspect to the story.
I wish I could keep up with it.
Interesting, isn't it? As well, that adds another dimension.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm trying very hard to keep up with the right hand. So Craig has just mentioned Peace by Gary Disher. He's long been a Gary Disher advocate. So
well, I would say I have no idea why Gary Disher isn't more popular in this country, and I hope it works for him with Viper, because he absolutely is a consummate crime writer.
Mm.
We mentioned 50/50 Playdate by Alex Stahl. I thought was very good. I haven't read The Reader's Room by Antoine Lorraine. Was that one that you picked, Paul?
Yeah, because it's a funny book. It's a sort of insider's book for the publishing trade too, but incredibly well written, and it just made me laugh. It's just one of those books that lifts your spirits, and it was brilliant for that reason.
Okay, Victoria, are you asked the following question? You might not, because you haven't written a slew of books on Scandinavian crime fiction as I have. I'm constantly asked, how's the Scandinavian bubble burst? What's your view?
How the bubble burst, why the bubble burst.
Yeah, how's it burst? Are people still reading the Scandinavians? Are they still watching the TV?
I'm not a Scandinavian crime novel reader, so it's a hard one for me to answer. I don't know. I think actually crime novels that we read are often reflective of the times we're in, aren't they? And I think that at the moment we're looking for a little bit of escapism, possibly, and something to lift our spirits and to solve a puzzle and to make us feel that actually all is well in the world because the bad guy will get punished. You don't agree, Paul? Okay, what's it? Great.
Paul, why do you dissent from that view, Paul?
Well, it's just that, I mean, people keep saying I want to read, so I don't. I want to read what I normally read, which is dark fiction that reflects on the world, and the world isn't a particularly nice place right now, and that's what I want to read about.
There you go, that reflects on the world.
I don't have this thing about reading just for relaxation and having an enjoyment. I definitely want to just stick to the dark side mostly.
But there are
one of the reasons why I enjoy Scandinavian crime fiction.
Well, going back to Scandinavian crime fiction, there are several shows at the moment which people are watching. We haven't got the way when Borgen was showing, which is kind of a thriller. And Adam Priester, who made it, said to me, sorry, it was a thriller. He said that the idea of a conglomerate government, two separate governments working, was exactly what we had in Britain at the same time. So it reflected that. There's still some great books being written by the Scandinavians. Have you spotted, either of you, any trends that are happening?
Well, we could please Craig and tell him that there's going to be a lot more books from New Zealand and Australia. I think that's true. I just think principally we've had some great writers with Jane Harvey. You mentioned Gary Disher, and there are plenty of other authors, Emma Viskick,
Jane Harper.
Simon. And I think, sorry?
Did you mean Jane Harper?
Jane Harper, sorry, what did I say?
Okay. Yeah. Jane Harper.
Anyway, yes, so no, that's what I meant anyway. And yes, I think what they're doing is, though, they're opening a door that there are going to be more authors coming over. Right. I think there's going to be more interest in it. And I think there's some fantastic fiction being written over there. People up their game off the back of the fiction that's being written around them, don't they? Sometimes it just gives you ideas and it sets things off, and I think that's one of the things that's happening.
Well,
that would be one trend.
You can't write in a vacuum, so you have to read to be able to write. And I think that's exactly the point. You bounce off other people's ideas, and rightly so. I actually think true crime is something that's going to be more and more of a thing. And we'll talk about Gurley in a minute, but I think that's something. Anyway, it's close to my heart. True crime.
True crime.
No, I wondered. Sorry, Barry.
I was just going to say about true crime writing can vary from In Cold Blood, a beautifully written book, in which Harper Lee we learned recently had and books like the Cannibal Crossbow Killer, which we got the meretricious. I'm sitting in a room with somebody who works on that book, so that's why I'm mentioning it. So true crime can be well written. It can also be pretty trashy. Do you not think, Victoria?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. But the same with any crime novel. There's always going to be good and bad. And just, it's a huge subject, isn't it? True crime. And there's all sorts of different ways you can play it. Yeah.
Well, sorry,
Okay,
I wouldn't be an expert on it, but it looks to me that there are better writers writing true crime.
I think that's...
and there's also a kind of democratization in what you do, Victoria, the podcast. There's an awful lot more talking about true crime in that sense.
And not reveling in the goriness of it, I think, for me as well, is an important part. So looking at it from, we've talked a lot, haven't we, on this panel about the humanity side of and the compassion in writing and multifaceted characters. And I think true crime needs to be seen in the same way. You don't, and actually in my writing as well, my series, Zeba Mackenzie series, is all about serial killers, profiling. But I don't, obviously the serial killers are bad guys, nobody's going to say they're not, but I try to see them as more than one-dimensional, and to get inside their head and to understand why they're doing what they're doing, not to excuse it, not to condone it, but just to understand and to realize that actually we all potentially have something monstrous in us if the right buttons.
As you're immensely young, Victoria, you're not going to get this reference, but I'm going to assume Paul just might, because he's very well read. A writer called Ludwig Kennedy. I'm sure you're.
Oh, indeed.
So Ludwig Kennedy, I once did an event with him. He'd written a book about serial killers, and a woman was queuing up to have the book signed by him, and this middle-class woman, very well dressed, handed in the book, and with a smile on her face said, "I have to say that people like you appeal to the very worst part of human nature. I think it's absolutely a disgrace that you are interested in the way these appalling monsters behave." And Ludwig Kennedy replies, "Understanding them. That's how we understand them." Do you agree with that, Victoria?
So you're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And in fact, that's the whole idea behind the BAU, isn't it? In Quantico, they needed to understand to be able to predict behaviour, to be able to catch them. So yeah, of course you need to understand them.
Okay.
But I think also just to understand evil is a part of what crime writers are about. That's why most of us write crime. We want to understand what drives people, I think.
Well, Paul, we've got only another officially 5 minutes or so, so we're going to talk briefly about what we're looking forward to in 2021. So when I last did crowdcasting, Deirdre O'Brien, a fellow writer on crime, said that, and I've got to be careful here because I'm trying to avoid spoilers, that Mick Herron's new book made her cry. Have you read it yet, Paul?
No, not yet. But I mean, I love Mick Herron. Guy doesn't care at all about spy stories, and he writes the best spy stories anybody's writing anywhere at the moment, which is quite incredible. It's just his books are just such fun to read.
Did you notice that the last John le Carré had a kind of washed-up group of spies passed the test? That's interesting that John le Carré is being influenced by a man who was influenced by him. So what else did we have? We had Femi Coyote, Light Seekers.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, I haven't read this book yet, but it's one of those you get this feeling for, and that's one of the books I'll be looking at next year. Similarly, The Khan by Simon Meir, who's a UK reporter. That's another one I'll be keeping an eye on. You've got Henry Porter, going back to the spy stories. You've got The Old Enemy by Henry Porter, a new book by him. He's kind of changed the way he's written the spy story and made it a very conscious thing. You know, it's very much in the real world now. You can have to do with the world of the UN and so on. You know, more about aid and things like that, and still manage to make it incredibly tense and spy oriented.
Okay, before I ask you, Victoria, for what you're looking forward to in 2021, I'll just mention that Henry Porter had an argument with once about surveillance. He was at one point obsessed with that we live in a surveillance society. And I met him in the offices of Orion. And he said, "You realize that on your walk from the tube station to here, you've been in 10 cameras. And I said, "Well, I don't mind. If that stopped me being mugged, I'm not going to do anything." Victoria, what are you looking forward to in 2021?
Well, I'm going to have to talk quickly on the clock's ticking. So I got my 3 books. Girl A is the one everyone is obviously talking about and talking about true crime. This is it. It's a girl who she survives a horrific ordeal and she lives to tell the tale, basically. And what I loved about this was, as I was saying before with some of the other books, with the 3 hours, it forced me to put myself in the protagonist's shoes and to say, what do I think I would have done? How might I have reacted? But also I loved the psychology of how the kids got into the place they were. The descent into darkness was beautifully done without being overly gory or grotesque. It was just very, very sensitively handled and a really brilliant read.
Okay.
also, sorry, I'm trying to go through these quickly.
Go ahead.
This one is The Last House on Needler Street by Catriona Ward. It's been described by some as a horror novel, and to me, it's not a horror novel. It's a crime novel with horrific elements.
Right.
The title suggests The Last House on the Left, so it sounds like a horror film.
It sounds like it, doesn't it? And you've got Stephen King, and there's a quote. Somebody says, "Oh, it's the best horror." I think it was Susan Hill or something said, "Oh, the best horror novel I've ever read." And they're definitely there. I can see there are bits that sort of have the tropes from horror novels in it. But to me, again, it's very psychological, and I won't spoil it because I can't think properly how to describe it without spoiling what's so brilliant about it. But pick it up and read it. It's just when you get to the point where you think you're told what's happening, you think you got it, and then the rug's pulled out, and then you think you've got it, and the rug's.
And then I noticed, Victoria, that Trevor Wood has just said, "Oh, I'm reading The Last House on Needler Street now." Very creepy. So there you go.
Trevor, I'll shut up now and put this.
I'm glad we've got such a interventionist audience, because they are talking about the books that we didn't get round to ourselves. So
well, they were posting on Twitter what we ought to be talking about, to be fair, which is where I got some of my list from. So I was listening to them.
Well, Victoria, we're still going to be told off for all the books we missed. So let's be ready for that tomorrow.
Okay, well, guys, we didn't miss them. We just didn't get to them. There's a difference.
Exactly. So my last choice for 2021 would be one that I actually thought I was going to be reviewing earlier, but it's been delayed. It's the new David Peace, Turkey Redux. And David Peace is somebody who's doing something that nobody else in the crime genre is doing. Do you agree, Paul?
Absolutely. Can I tell you a story about this? We've got quick time. I asked Joe Thomas to interview David Peace because he's a big fan of David Peace and the writing style fit in everything anyway. So I asked him, would he do the interview? So he prepared all the questions and everything, got back to Faber and said, right, we're ready to go for the interview. And they said, yeah, but the book's not coming out for another year. So he's still sitting with his questions. And when it comes to June next year, he said, I'm still ready to go. He wants to do the interview.
I hope it does appear. We've got a couple of minutes left. So I'm just going to ask Victoria a question. So far as I know, Paul, you've not written any fiction. Am I right?
You'd be right about that.
And I only
some of my reviews border on that.
I only write non-fiction as well. So Victoria, second novel syndrome. How terrifying did you find the notion of that second book?
It's funny. We were talking about this in the green room. So for me, my second book was part of a series. So it didn't feel like a second book. It just felt like slipping into a pair of slippers that I'd been walking around the house in. But after the third book and after stepping away from the series, I started writing a standalone. And I found it really, really difficult, actually, to leave the world that I'd created behind, the character I'd got to know so well behind. And actually, in a way, I've put that one to one side now and I'm writing something different, which is much more true crimey as it happens. And it's almost like I've needed that palate cleanser of what would have been my supposed second book, I suppose, to be able to write what now is. So I think it's difficult. You've got something hanging over you. You've been very immersed in something. You've had something successful, and it's difficult to believe that will happen again. But I think as you know, people like Harriet, who I know have worried about that, she's talked quite openly about it. I think there was an article in The Independent recently when she talked about it, have shown actually you can do it, and you just have to have the faith to push on and you know, keep going. I think
you've also you've edited. So am I right in thinking you edited a book which has contributions by the great Val McDermid and other people? Tell us about that.
Yes, I have, and I wish I had a paperback to hold up now. It's only just come out today. So this is our Christmas crime anthology, Afraid of the Christmas Lights, which we're giving all our money to all the profits to domestic abuse charities. And it features 18 best-selling authors, including, as you say, the very wonderful Mark Billingham, Sophie Hannah, Harriet Tice wrote a Blood Orange original for us. Val McDermid wrote an incredible foreword. I've also put a story in, and we've been blown away actually by people's response to it. It's been phenomenal. It was in the Observer actually the other day on the weekend. So with my face mask, I ran out to buy myself a coffee and gobbled up what they said about us.
You see how I allowed Victoria to do that little plug there, Paul?
Thank you.
Anyway, the books that we didn't discuss.
She'll come back now.
Yes, she will. The books that we didn't discuss, we are going to post on the Crime Time website tomorrow, including all the ones that we would have talked about tonight had we time. So can I thank the absent Laura Wilson? Can I thank Paul Burke? Can I thank Victoria Selman? And thank you all for attending, and good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.